The champagne tower came down in one long silver crash, 300 coupe glasses folding into each other, like the whole night had finally told the truth. And for about 2 seconds, nobody in that white tent moved. Then the screaming started. But it wasn't about the glasses. I want you to understand something before I take you back into it. I had already taken off my shoes. I'd already set down the cheap flute they'd handed me, the one they gave the vendors, not the family. And I was already walking toward the water, before my brother Gordon even registered that his youngest son was no longer on the dock. People think emergencies feel loud. They don't. They go very quiet. And very wide. Like the air gets bigger. The band stopped. A woman near me said, "Oh," the way people say it, when their mind hasn't caught up to their eyes, and out past the end of the dock, in the gray chop where the lake dropped off deep and cold, a small white shoe was floating, where a 5-year-old used to be. I was 51 years old. I'd worn my oldest dress on purpose. For 30 years, my family had told a story about me. That I'd thrown my life away on swimming. That I was the one who never amounted to anything. The spinster aunt who smelled like salt water. And disappointment. They told it so often I'd stopped correcting it. I let them believe it. It was easier. And it was useful. And to be honest, after enough years, I'd grown curious. I wanted to know how a family treats someone. They're certain has nothing to offer them. That night, in front of 200 people they'd spent a fortune to impress, I finally found out. But to explain why a retired admiral ended up standing at attention in a wedding tent, and why my brother couldn't meet my eyes for the rest of his life, I need to take you back, all the way back, to the dinner tables where it started. My name is Rita Sorensen. I'm 51. I live in a 1-bedroom rental, above a marine supply store in a small harbor town, the kind of place where the rent is reasonable. Because the building smells faintly of diesel and rope. I drive a 16-year-old Tacoma with a cracked taillight I keep meaning to fix. I make coffee in a stovetop pot. My left shoulder aches when it's going to rain, which it does often where I live. And on the bad mornings, I can't lift a gallon of milk over my head with that arm, so I lift it with the other, and don't make a thing of it. Most people who meet me assume I'm a retired school teacher, or maybe a nurse who got tired of nursing. I let them believe it. That sentence is going to matter, so I'll say it plainly. I have spent most of my adult life letting people believe a smaller version of me than the real one. Not out of shame, out of choice. When you've spent years being the thing people are most relieved to see, when their boat is sinking, you learn that a uniform and a record can become a kind of noise. People stop talking to you and start talking to the resume. So when I retired, I packed all of it into a cedar box and put the box on a closet shelf, and I went looking for the woman underneath the rank. I wanted to be known as a person before I was known for what I'd done. After enough years, attention gets heavy. I wanted to set it down. I keep one thing out of the box, a brass whistle on a faded orange lanyard, the kind every rescue swimmer carries. The kind you blow when the rotor wash is too loud for a voice. The brass has gone soft and dark from being held. I carry it in my cardigan pocket, the way some people carry a worry stone. I don't blow it. I just like knowing it's there. There's exactly one thing about me that doesn't fit the schoolteacher story, and most people never notice it. When I walk into a room, I find the exits and the water without meaning to. A pool, a pond, a fountain. To the lake out a window. My eyes go there first, and they stay half on it the whole time I'm in the room. My ex-husband used to say I never fully sat down anywhere. He wasn't wrong. Some part of me is always counting the seconds it would take to reach the deep end. That habit was about to become the only thing in that wedding tent that mattered. To understand the wedding, you have to understand the dinners. And to understand the dinners, you have to understand my brother. Gordon is 4 years younger than me, and was, from birth, the one the family had decided would carry the name. Our father sold commercial insurance, and believed the most important thing a person could do was look like they were doing well. Gordon obliged him. He grew up handsome and easy, the kind of boy who got the benefit of the doubt, the way other people get parking tickets, automatically, repeatedly, without earning it. He went into real estate development. He built a regional career out of a confident handshake and other people's money, and for a long time it worked, the way it works for a lot of men, who never had to learn the difference between confidence and competence. I went the other way. I joined the Coast Guard at 19, which in my family was treated roughly the way you'd treat a daughter, announcing she was running off with a carnival. My father's exact words, at the dinner table, were that I'd found a creative way to avoid making something of myself. I remember he said it while cutting his pork chop, not even looking up, the way you'd comment on the weather. My mother changed the subject to Gordon's new sales job. Nobody asked me a single question about it. That was the first dinner. There would be 3 decades of them. Let me give you the pattern. Because the pattern is the whole point. Wave 1 was always small and deniable. At Thanksgivings, when someone politely asked what I did, Gordon would answer for me before I could. Rita splashes around for Uncle Sam, he'd say, and everyone would laugh. And I'd let it go, because correcting it would have made me the difficult one. He called it swimming. For 30 years. To my family, my entire career was swimming. The same word you'd use for a child in a kiddie pool. I let them. I never corrected that assumption. It's amazing what people will tell you when they're certain you're harmless. Wave 2 got bolder. Once it was clear, no one would push back. By the time I made it past the rescue swimmer pipeline, which has a washout rate that would make most people weep, though my family never asked about it, Gordon had built himself a story where I was the family's cautionary tale, the sister who chose a hobby over a future. At my father's retirement party, Gordon gave a toast about building something that lasts, and looked at me when he said the part about people who drift through life. Riptide, I thought, and almost laughed out loud, because they had no idea. Sloane, his wife. Gordon married a woman who treated waitstaff like furniture, and treated me like the waitstaff. Laughed into her wine, and said, loud enough to carry, that at least I'd stayed in shape. I want to be fair to them, because the prompt of my own life keeps asking me to be. I don't think Gordon woke up in the morning, planning to be cruel. I think something simpler, and more dangerous, was happening. He had built his sense of himself out of being the one who succeeded. And that story only worked if there was someone in the family who failed. He needed me to be small so that he could feel large. My whole life, I was the floor he stood on to look taller. He never once wondered what was holding the floor up. Here are the numbers I never said out loud at any of those tables. 22 years on active duty. Over 400 hoists. I'd been lowered on a cable into water cold enough to stop a heart, in seas tall enough to swallow the helicopter whole. More times than I let myself count. I came up through the enlisted ranks as an aviation survival technician, earned my commission, and finished as a commander, running search and rescue for an entire sector of the Atlantic. There is a night they teach at the Rescue Swimmer School in California. They teach it to teach young swimmers what a body and a will can do, at the edge of what's possible. And that night has my call sign on it, Riptide. 9 people came home alive, who would not have. 1 didn't. I still know his name. I'll always know his name. My family knew none of it. Not the rank. Not the medals folded in the cedar box. Not the night off Hatteras. They knew swimming. There was one Christmas, 11 or 12 years ago, when I almost told them I'd just been selected for command. I'd flown in late. And there was a moment after dinner when the house got quiet. And my mother, who was still alive then, asked me, in a small voice, if I was happy out there. All by yourself. And I opened my mouth to tell her. I had it right there. Mom, I run search and rescue for a sector of the Atlantic. People are alive who would be dead. I'm not by myself. I'm surrounded by the best people I've ever known. I had all of it loaded and ready. And before I could say a word, Gordon walked back in from the kitchen with a fresh drink and said, "Mom, leave her alone. Not everybody needs the whole house and the kids. Rita's got her little swimming thing. She's fine." And he ruffled my hair like I was 9 years old, and I watched my mother's face settle into relief, because Gordon had given her a smaller, easier daughter to worry about. And I put the truth back in my pocket, and I let her have the easier version. She died 18 months later, and I let her go believing the easy version. That one I did to myself, and I'll own it. I let them write the story, because the pen felt heavy and I was tired. Or so I thought. I'd find out, much later, that my mother had been keeping her own version of the story all along. But that's the end of this, not the middle. So let it wait. I think about the man I lost off Hatteras more than I think about any of those dinners. His name was Eddie Marsh. He was the cook on the Beaufort Belle, 58 years old. And I got a hand on his collar on my 8th trip down. And the sea took him back out of my grip. Before the cable could come tight, I've had 30 years to make peace with the fact that you cannot save everyone, and I have not finished making it. So when my brother stood at our father's retirement party and made a toast about people who drift through life, and looked at me when he said it, what he didn't know, what he could not possibly have known, is that I was at that moment, somewhere off Cape Hatteras, in the dark, with my hand closing on an empty collar, telling Eddie Marsh I was sorry. That's where I always go. My family thought the faraway look on my face was disinterest. It was a man I couldn't reach. The moment silence stopped being possible came 2 weeks before the wedding. On the phone, Gordon called, which he only ever did when he needed something, to give me my instructions. His son Tyler was getting married at the Lake Estate, a big tented affair. The bride's family very distinguished, and he wanted to be delicate about it. He said the seating was tight. He said it would mean a lot if I could help keep an eye on the day of details, since I was good at logistics and not really a guest of honor type anyway, he said. And I wrote it down later because I wanted to remember it, exactly. Just, don't make it a whole thing about the Coast Guard stuff. These are serious people. Serious people. I said I'd be glad to come. I meant it. And I decided, sitting in my truck in the marine store parking lot with the brass whistle in my hand, that I would wear the oldest dress I owned and say nothing about myself to anyone. And I would simply watch. One more time. The last time. How my family treated a woman they believed had nothing to offer. I told myself it was the last time, because I'd already half decided to be done with them. I had no way of knowing the lake had other plans. The Lake Estate belonged to the bride's people. And you could tell. White tents the size of barns. A dock that ran out 40 feet into deep water. A champagne tower the caterers had been stacking since noon. The bride's father was apparently somebody important, a retired admiral. Gordon kept saying the word admiral, like a man saying Rolex. And the whole Sorensen side was on its very best behavior, which mostly meant being loudly humble about things that weren't humble at all. I arrived in my 15-year-old dress, and was handed a vendor lanyard at the gate, by a young woman with a clipboard who apologized, and said the family must have made a mistake. I told her it wasn't a mistake. I clipped it on. Sloane found me near the bar 20 minutes later, looked me up and down, and said it was so practical of me to wear something I wouldn't worry about. Then she put me to work folding place cards. I folded place cards. There's a particular freedom in being underestimated. You get to see everything. What I saw was that the weather was turning. The afternoon had that flat, copper light that comes before a summer storm, and the lake, which had been glassy at noon, had started to chop. The wind was pushing whitecaps against the pilings, and the surface temperature was dropping, the way lake water does when a front shoves cold air down onto it. Nobody else noticed. They were watching the bride. I was watching the water, because I always watch the water. I noticed the children, too. There were maybe a dozen of them, and they'd been chasing each other up and down that long dock all afternoon. While the adults drank, the dock had no railing. I'd clocked that within the first 5 minutes, the way you'd notice a gas leak. At one point I mentioned it, quietly, to Gordon, that someone might want to keep the little ones off the end of the dock, with the water getting rough, he said, without looking at me. Rita, relax. It's a wedding, not a Coast Guard drill. Sloane laughed. I let it go. I went back to the place cards, but I moved my chair so I could see the dock. That is the detail I add to this story, that no one would think to add unless they'd lived it. I had already failed to be heard about the exact thing that was about to happen, and I had already, quietly, repositioned myself to be ready for it anyway. That's not heroism. That's just what 22 years does to a person. You stop expecting to be listened to, and you start positioning yourself to be useful when you're proven right. The toasts had just begun. Gordon was on the dais being charming. The champagne tower glittered under the tent lights, and out at the end of the dock, a small boy in a tiny gray suit, Gordon and Sloane's youngest, my nephew Danny, 5 years old. The ring bearer leaned out over the dark water to look at something. A fish, a reflection. I'll never know what. And the wind caught him, and he went in. There was no splash anyone heard over the music. There was just, suddenly, no boy. I want to slow this down, because everything that mattered about my entire life happened in the next 90 seconds, and I've thought about it 10,000 times since. A woman saw the empty space where Danny had been and made that sound. Oh. And then someone screamed his name, and the scream traveled across the tent and hit the dais, and Sloane's face came apart. Gordon froze with the microphone in his hand. The crowd surged toward the dock all at once, 200 people in formal wear moving toward the water in a panic, which is exactly the wrong thing, because a crowd on a dock is just more people about to drown, and I was already moving the other way to the side, to the open water, where the current would take him. Because here is what nobody in that tent understood, and what I understood instantly. That lake had a riptide, not an ocean rip, but the same physics wind over a long fetch, a drop-off, an outflow near the channel. The wind was pushing the surface, and the surface was pushing a 5-year-old in a wet suit jacket, away from the dock, toward the deep, faster than any of those screaming people could run. The men diving off the end of the dock were going to come up empty, because they were looking where he went in, instead of where the water was taking him. Training took over. Not panic. Not anger. Training. I read the wind. I read the chop. I found the seam in the current where an unconscious body would track, and I went into the water there, 20 yards down current from the dock, in a 15-year-old dress. With a 51-year-old shoulder that can't lift a gallon of milk on a bad morning, the cold hit like a closed fist. I'd forgotten you always forget how the cold takes your breath, and tries to take your judgment with it. The first 10 seconds in cold water are the ones that kill people, because the body panics and the mind follows it, and the panic tells you to thrash and gasp and fight for the surface, and every one of those instincts is wrong. I let the cold pass through me. I'd been here before. In worse. In the dark. In seas that wanted me dead. A lake in July was nothing. I got my head up, sighted the seam where the current ran, and swam into it instead of against it. The way you have to. The way nobody who hasn't been trained will ever believe, until it saves their life. Behind me, I could hear the dock falling apart with good intentions. 3 grown men had jumped in off the end, right where Danny went down, and they were already in trouble, fully clothed, churning the water white, looking down for a boy who wasn't there anymore, because the current had carried him 40 feet to my left, while they were still pulling off their shoes. That's the cruelest thing about drowning. It doesn't look like the movies. There's no waving, no shouting, no splashing. It's quiet and it's fast. And it happens exactly where you're not looking. I have watched strong men drown 6 feet from a rescuer who was searching the wrong patch of water. The lake doesn't care how much you love the person it's taking. I found him 8 feet down, already going limp. His little gray suit dark and heavy. His eyes half open and gone somewhere far away. There's a particular stillness to a drowning child that I will not describe to you in detail, because some of you are parents and you don't need to carry it. I'll only say that I have seen it before, and that the part of me that feels things had already stepped into the next room and shut the door, the way it learns to, so that the part of me that works could do the job without shaking. I got a cross-chest carry on him, the same carry I've done 400 times, the one with my name on it in a classroom in California, and I drove for the surface. And I got us both up into the wind and the noise. And I started clearing his airway before we even reached the shallows, because there is no time. There is never any time. The brain starts dying in minutes, and I'd already spent 90 seconds I would never get back. I counted them. I'm always counting them. Eddie Marsh taught me to count them, even though he never knew it. I dragged him up onto the muddy bank away from the trampling crowd, laid him flat, tilted his head, and I breathed for him. I have to step out of the water for a moment to tell you about the phone call from that morning, because it's the only reason this story has a witness who could name what I was. I'd called Senior Chief Dale Okafor that morning from the parking lot of the Lake Estate, sitting in my truck, working up the will to go in and fold place cards. Dale was my flight mechanic for 11 years. He ran the hoist on the night off Hatteras. He's the man who lowered me into that water and pulled me out of it, again and again. And he is one of maybe 4 people on Earth who knows exactly what I am. I'd called him because I was nervous, which is a thing I almost never am, and which I'd never have admitted to anyone but Dale. I told him about the vendor lanyard, the serious people, the don't make it a whole thing about the Coast Guard stuff. I told him I'd half a mind to just not go. Dale was quiet for a second. Then he said, in that low gravel of his, Commander, you went into Force 10Cs off Hatteras and brought 9 people home. You can survive your brother's open bar. And then he said the thing I carried into that tent like a stone in my pocket, right next to the whistle. They don't know who they're standing next to. That's not your problem to fix. Just go be who you are. The day finds out or it doesn't. I told him I'd just get through the toasts and leave. I told him I wasn't going to make it a thing. The day found out. The boy came back on the 4th breath. He coughed up half the lake onto the mud, and then he cried, which is the most beautiful sound in the entire world, when it comes out of a child who 2 minutes ago wasn't breathing. And I rolled him onto his side and held his small shaking body against the wind, and said the thing I've said to 100 people on 100 decks. I've got you. I've got you. You're okay. I've got you. And for that one moment, the only 2 people on Earth were me and a 5-year-old, who was going to grow up after all. 30 years ago, off Cape Hatteras, a man's collar slipped out of my hand and the sea took him back. And I have carried the shape of that empty grip in my palm every day since. I kept my hand closed on that little gray suit the whole way to the bank. This collar did not slip. Some debts you can't pay back to the person you owe them. You pay them forward, in cold water, to a stranger's child. 30 years late, when I looked up, the whole wedding was standing around us in a silent ring. 200 people in their good clothes. Not moving. Not speaking. The band had stopped. The wind had laid down for a second the way it does. And in the long quiet, I could hear exactly one thing. I could hear the lake, lapping against the dock pilings. Slap, slap, slap. The same indifferent water that takes everyone eventually, that I have spent my whole life reaching into to take people back from. Slap, slap. That was the only sound. Then a young man in a groomsman's tux pushed through the ring and dropped to his knees beside me, and I saw on his collar under the rented bow tie a small pin most people would never recognize. A rescue swimmer's pin. He looked at how I was holding the boy. He looked at the way I'd cleared the airway, the angle of the carry, the position of my hands. And I watched it happen on his face, frame by frame, the recognition, the disbelief, the recalculation, the way you watch the sun come up, before I tell you what that young man said, and why a 4-star wedding went silent as a church. Do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because what happened in the next 60 seconds, in front of the people my brother spent a fortune to impress, is the part nobody in that tent ever forgot. Stay with me. The young man, his name, I'd learn, was Marcus Reyes, AST3, 2 years out of the school in California. The groom's cousin looked at me and said, very quietly, like he was afraid to be wrong, "Ma'am, that's a Sorensen carry." I didn't say anything. I just held the boy. "They teach it at the school," he said, and his voice cracked. "The Hatteras swimmer, riptide." He said the call sign like a word from scripture. "That's your riptide." That was when the champagne tower came down. I never found out who backed into it. Someone in the stunned crowd shifted their weight, and 300 coupe glasses folded into a long silver crash that went on and on. Glass on, glass on, glass. The most expensive sound I've ever heard, and when it finally stopped, the silence behind it was total. No band, no wind, just the lake. Slap, slap, and into that silence, a man's voice said one word, "Riptide." I looked up. An older man had come through the crowd, silver-haired, straight-backed, in a beautifully cut suit. The kind of man a room organizes itself around without being asked. The bride's father. The Admiral Gordon had been saying like a brand name all afternoon. Rear Admiral Cyrus Hale, United States Coast Guard. Retired. Except he wasn't looking at the wedding anymore. He was looking at me the way you look at someone you'd long ago decided you'd never see again. "Cyrus," I said. 8 years and 1,000 miles fell away. Long time. Because 30 years ago, off Cape Hatteras, in seas that took the Beaufort Belle and everyone said couldn't be flown, a young rescue pilot had held a helicopter steady over a dying ship through 9 separate hoists, while his swimmer went into the water again and again and again. That pilot had put me in for the medal I'd never told my family about. That pilot was now standing in his daughter's wedding tent, looking at the woman his crew had lowered into hell, the woman who'd just walked into a different cold water and carried his my family's child, back out of it. He came to attention, a 70-year-old man in a Tom Ford suit, in the wreckage of his daughter's champagne tower, brought himself to attention the way you do for something you respect more than you respect yourself. And young Marcus Reyes, kneeling in the mud, brought his hand up in a salute that trembled. And then it spread, the way it always does, one person at a time. Off to the right, an old man in a gray suit, the bride's great-uncle. Somebody told me later, a Navy man who'd done 2 tours in the Gulf of Tonkin set down his cane and pushed himself up out of his chair and stood, unsteadily. Because you stand. You just stand. A woman near the bar, a flight nurse, it turned out, rose next. A young soldier on leave who'd come as somebody's date stood and came to attention in his rented suit. It moved through that tent, like wind through grass. The people who knew what they were looking at rising first, and the people who didn't following. Because something in the air told them this was a moment you stood for. Within a half a minute, half that wedding was on its feet, not for the bride, not for the groom, for a soaking wet woman in a 15-year-old dress sitting in the mud with a breathing child in her arms. My family stayed seated. They didn't know to stand. That, more than anything, is the picture I kept. A whole tent rising around my brother while he sat frozen at the dais. The only man in the room who'd had a lifetime to learn who his sister was, and had chosen, every single day, not to. For 50 years I had been the floor he stood on to feel tall. Now the floor was on its feet, and the whole room was rising with it. And he was the only one still sitting down. I didn't stand. I had a 5-year-old breathing against my chest, and I wasn't going to put him down for anyone. So I just looked back at them, and at the 200 faces, half of them on their feet now, and at my brother Gordon at the edge of it all with the microphone still dead in his hand, and his mouth open and nothing coming out. Sloane was the first of my family to find words, she said, and I'll never forget the smallness of it, Rita. You swim? I looked at her for a long moment. The boy hiccuped against me. The lake went slap against the pilings. You never asked, I said. That was all. 4 words. My brother stood at that dais holding the only microphone in the tent, the loudest thing in the room. the thing he'd spent his whole life being, and he never found one word to put through it. I had no shoes and a lake in my dress, and I had 4. I'd waited 30 years, and that was all it took. Because the truth had finally walked into the room on its own legs and didn't need me to raise my voice for it. The paramedics came. They checked Danny, and the senior medic listened to my report respiratory rate. Time submerged. Time to first breath. Color. Responsiveness. And then he stopped writing and looked at me and said, "You did everything exactly right. That's why he's talking." And I said, "I know," and he laughed. A short, surprised laugh, because most people don't say "I know." They say "thank God." But I did know. Knowing is the whole job. They took Danny to the hospital as a precaution. And he was discharged the next morning with nothing wrong but a bad memory he was already losing, the way 5-year-olds do. Sloane rode in the ambulance. Gordon did not. Gordon stood in the trampled grass next to the wreckage of a champagne tower that cost more than my truck. And he watched the ambulance leave. And then he turned and looked for me. And found me by the water, wringing lake out of my 15-year-old dress. He came over. He didn't know what to do with his hands. "Rita." He stopped. Started again. "I didn't all these years. I didn't know that you..." "You didn't ask," I said. Not cruelly. Just the fact of it. For 30 years. "Gordon. You had a sister who pulled people out of the ocean for a living. And you told everyone she went swimming. And the worst part isn't that you were wrong." I wrung out the hem. Set it down. "The worst part is that it never once occurred to you that you might be. You were so sure I was small that you never bothered to look." He opened his mouth, closed it. He looked, for the first time in our lives, like a man who'd just discovered the floor he'd been standing on his whole life was a person, and that the person had a name and a history and 9 souls off Cape Hatteras, and that he'd spent 5 decades standing on her, without ever once looking down. "I'm sorry," he said. "And here's the thing I'll be honest about. Because I promised myself I'd always be honest in these stories. I don't know if he was sorry that he'd been cruel, or sorry that he'd been caught. Sorry that 200 serious people had just watched an admiral salute the sister he'd seated with the caterers. I genuinely don't know. Maybe he didn't either. People don't change on a schedule. Sometimes the apology arrives years before the understanding does, and you have to decide whether to wait around for the rest. I didn't decide that night. I just said, "Take care of your boy, Gordon." And I left the door open exactly that far. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Just the possibility of it. Sitting out there in the dark water where anything is possible. Admiral Hale walked me to my truck. He didn't make a speech. He'd never been a speech man. You don't fly a helicopter into Force 10 by talking. "At the truck," he said. "I looked for you, after, to say thank you properly. They told me you'd transferred out. I wanted to be a person for a while," I said. "Instead of a record." He nodded like that was the most sensible thing he'd heard all year. Then he said, "My granddaughter's alive because of who you decided to be 30 years ago and who you still are." He stopped. "I won't tell anyone what you are, if that's still what you want, but I wanted you to know one of us remembers." "One's enough," I said. And it was. It always had been. That was the thing my family never understood about me. I'd never needed a room to know. I'd only needed to know myself. The weeks after were quieter than I expected, and stranger. The story got around, the way stories do at weddings full of important people. And for about a month my phone did things it had never done. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in 15 years called to tell me she'd always known there was more to me, which was a generous edit of a woman who'd laughed at every one of Gordon's jokes. Sloane sent a card, an actual card, in the mail, in her careful handwriting. And most of it was the kind of thing you'd expect. "We are so grateful." We don't have the words, but at the bottom, almost as an afterthought, she'd written one line that I've kept. "I'm ashamed of the lanyard." 4 words of her own. Underneath all the careful ones. People reveal themselves in the afterthoughts. That line cost her something, and I knew it. And I sent back a card that said, "Thank you for writing," and nothing else. Because some doors you open 1 inch at a time or not at all. Tyler. The groom, my nephew. The reason for the whole expensive day drove 3 hours to my apartment 2 weeks later, by himself, and sat at my little kitchen table and asked me to tell him about Hatteras. Not the wedding. Hatteras. He'd looked it up. He wanted to hear it from me. So I made coffee in the stovetop pot, and I told a 26-year-old man the story I'd never told my own mother. And he cried a little. And I didn't. And when he left, he hugged me too long, the way you do when you're trying to say something you don't have words for yet. He's the one who walked through the open door. Funny, I'd spent my life waiting for my brother and my father to come through it. And it turned out to be the boy 2 generations down, who never had any stake in keeping me small. Gordon and I have spoken 4 times since the wedding. 2 were real conversations, careful. Both of them short. One was about money. He didn't quite get to the asking part before I changed the subject. And once, late on a Tuesday, he called and didn't say a word, just breathed on the line for a while and hung up. He has not yet figured out whether he's sorry he was cruel or sorry he was caught. And I've decided I can wait. The way you wait on water without needing it to be anything other than what it is. The lake house invitations stopped that summer, in the 11 months since. The family that spent 30 years building a story about me hasn't decided what to put in its place. The door is open exactly that far. We'll see who comes through it. And then there was the thing I think about most, the thing the whole wedding stirred loose. A month after, I finally opened the box of my mother's things I'd carried from move to move for years and never once been able to open. Her reading glasses, a church bulletin, the Bible she'd had since before I was born, the leather gone soft at the spine, and folded into the back of it, behind the last page, a newspaper clipping yellowed, worn to felt at the creases from being handled, a Norfolk paper 30 years old. The Beaufort Bell. The rescue off Hatteras, my name in it, my call sign. She had cut it out and folded it, and kept it in the one book she opened every single day. And she had handled it so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth. And in 18 months of dying, with me sitting right beside her, she never said a word about it. Not once. So it turned out we were the same, my mother and me. 2 women in the same family, each keeping the true story folded small in a pocket the other couldn't see, each letting the other believe the easy version, me, because I was tired, her because, I think. She didn't know how to be proud of a daughter out loud in a house that only knew how to be proud of a son. I don't know which of us that's sadder for. I've stopped trying to decide. I keep the clipping in my own Bible now, folded into the same soft creases her hands made. Some truths get handed down the way water is quietly, from one keeping to the next. I drove home that night with the windows down and the storm finally breaking over the highway. Real rain now, the kind that washes the salt off everything. When I got back to my apartment above the marine store, I took the brass whistle out of my soaked cardigan pocket, and I dried it on a towel, slowly, the way you'd dry off something living, and I set it on the windowsill where the morning light comes in over the harbor. Out the window, the boats sat at their moorings in the gray dawn, rising and falling on the same indifferent water. It looked exactly the way it always looks. Nothing about the harbor knew that anything had changed. But I did. I made my coffee in the stovetop pot, and my shoulder ached because it was still raining. And I lifted the cup with my good arm and didn't make a thing of it. I'd carried a child out of the cold and set him back down, breathing in his mother's arms. I'd said 4 true words to a woman who'd spent 30 years deciding I was nothing. And then I'd come home to a small life I chose on purpose. And it fit me the way it always had. That was the whole victory. Not the salute, not the Admiral, not Gordon's face. Just this. A quiet kitchen, a brass whistle drying in the light, and a woman who finally stopped waiting for her family to tell her what she was worth. People ask me what I remember most from that night, and they expect me to say the salute, or the Admiral, or the long silver sound of 300 glasses coming down all at once. It isn't any of those. What I remember is the first thing, a small white shoe, floating on dark water at the end of a dock, in the half-second before my mind caught up to my eyes. For 30 years, my family had looked at my life and seen exactly that. Something small, drifting out on deep water, already gone, a washout, a wasted thing the current had carried away. They never once understood that the whole time. I was the one who went into the water after the small things it tried to take. I'd been doing it my entire life. They just never looked at the water long enough to see me swimming. I've thought a lot, since that night, about why my brother needed me to be small. I don't think it was hatred. It was simpler and sadder than that. Some people build their sense of themselves out of being more than someone, and that arithmetic only works if there's a less. My brother needed a less. For 50 years I volunteered for the role because keeping the peace felt like love. I told myself that swallowing the small insults was patience. It wasn't. Patience is a choice you make from strength. What I was doing was disappearing, one swallowed comment at a time, so that people who never protected me could stay comfortable. There is a difference between a quiet life and a silenced one. I chose the quiet life, the rental, the old truck, the whistle on the windowsill, and it's mine. And it's full. But for 30 years, I also lived a silenced life inside my own family. And it took a 5-year-old going into a cold lake to show me they were not the same thing. You are allowed to be modest about what you've done, without letting anyone convince you it was nothing. You are allowed to stop explaining your worth to people, who only want to know it the moment it becomes useful to them. I left the door open with Gordon. Some of you would have shut it, and you wouldn't be wrong. I don't know yet whether I was being graceful or just being the floor again. But you don't have to decide the rest of a relationship in a single night. You can leave a door open exactly far enough to see who walks through it, and then watch the way I learned to watch water, patiently, without needing it to be anything other than what it is. They named me Riptide a long time ago. People hear it and think of the current that drags swimmers out to sea. The thing that pulls you away from everyone. The thing that drowns you. For 30 years. That's exactly what my family thought my life was. A wasted, drifting thing. But anyone who's been trained knows the truth about a riptide. It doesn't drown the people who understand it. And it was never about being pulled out to sea. It was about being the one who swims into the deep water, on purpose, when everyone else is screaming on the shore and brings the drowning back home. They thought the name meant I'd drifted away from them. It meant I was always the one coming back for them. They just never asked. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who may need this reminder today, someone who's spent too long being the floor other people stand on, who's waited too long to be asked. There are more of us out here than you think, and the water remembers all of our names.